Okay, you don't see, hear, touch, like, much less everyone else experiencing the same hallucination. We'll look at mass hallucinations. Mass hallucinations are a thing, but like they are simply a component of group delusion. So that's when everyone in the group is real excited and wanting to see something, and then they see something, but the details are different. The death is in the details. When a group of people sees something, and they're like into the details are different. It doesn't happen to a sad and defeated group, and the details are different. Like the way it's described there in Luke, it's like that's not a hallucination. There's no way. So, I mean, what do you do with that? Well, the critics and the atheists and the skeptics just simply say, "Hey, who wrote Luke?" Doesn't I mean where they question who wrote Luke, and they yes, we can prove things from Luke and Matthew and Mark and John that like Jesus really said this and Jesus really did this, and that this part right here goes back to the original Jesus. But the entirety of Luke, the entirety of Mark, the entirety of John, the entirety of Matthew is a bigger, more difficult battle to prove that like every bit of it goes back to the historical Jesus. So you can fight that battle, but what we're going to do is just take an easier route than fighting that battle, because the issue is like what we need to talk about is like what kind of appearances of Jesus, what properties did these supposed hallucinations really have? Okay, so instead of while the Gospels are considered historically our best source for the life of Jesus before he died, historians don't consider them a good source for for what happened after Jesus died. They think that like things were added in, or like stuff like that. So there's ways around those problems for this part and that part. We looked at in that video about what did Jesus really teach about himself. But we're going to avoid that battle. It's not like that battle can't be fought, but that takes a long time. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to go back to what Mike Lacona calls the POW. Okay, or POW. Okay, so POW, what is POW? Well, POW starts with P of Paul. Okay, so of the books of the New Testament that say Paul wrote them at the beginning, where it's like, I, Paul, write this to you. All right, skeptical scholars do dispute 6 of the 13. All right, fine. We won't fight that battle. They're still giving us Romans, 1st, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians. All of those books are uncontested. Nobody contests that. The Apostle Paul wrote those. Okay, so they're actually loaded with information. So, like, Paul tells us in Galatians that he, saw Jesus, and that this is a revelation from Jesus. He went to Arabia, and he was taught the gospel message that he teaches. He was taught it by Jesus himself. It's in Galatians chapter 1. So, like, that means that Paul, it's an audio-video thing for Paul. And again, let's be clear, he was willing to die for this because, if you just read 2 Corinthians beginning to end, he makes it real clear about why he's willing to put his life on the line. It's not just that he was willing to take a risk and try to make some money off Christianity, but put his life on the line constantly. That this was a constant thing, that repeatedly we're going back out there and doing it. So it's not just that he was willing to take a risk of maybe dying, but he was willing to die for this, which is not the same thing. But we looked at the evidence for that, but he's real clear in 2 Corinthians, for example, that it's because Jesus Christ died and then God raised him from the dead. That's why he's not afraid to die for spreading the message of Jesus. That's what it's all about. Okay, and the other Christian witnesses talk about this too, but we have Paul. It's important for us to point this out. Paul's hallucination, if it did occur, would have been multimodal, not unimodal. In other words, he didn't just hear Jesus, he heard and saw Jesus. I mean, he talks about Jesus, he was blinded, is what it says in Acts. I don't know that Paul says that in any of his letters that he was blinded, but he certainly, says Jesus appeared to him. So that means he saw something. And then he says, he got his message from Jesus, So if it was visual only, I guess Jesus held up a bunch of flashcards with words on. That's even crazier. Okay, so anyway, there's another issue with this of where Paul would have been experiencing repeat hallucinations. We're not even dealing with that. That's a whole. We're trying to be as generous as possible to the other side here, and as minimal as possible in what we prove. But we know that Paul was willing to die for this. So Paul's an issue. And for example, John Dominic Crossan is a skeptical historian who he just says Paul hallucinated and then everyone else was deluded. Gerd Ludemann is a skeptical historian who says Peter and Paul. I think there was one other one, I forgot the guy's name, but he says that Peter was hallucinated. Peter hallucinated. So you've got to have somebody hallucinating in there that really saw something. Okay. The odds of a multimodal hallucination occurring are low. It's 0.8%. Whereas if it's purely visual, you're talking about, okay, well, what number do we come up with for that? Well, like we said, we'll just give the opposing side really good odds of 7%, because that's bereaved senior adults. They have this 7% visual hallucination rate. So we're just being generous there. So there's Paul. Now we also have POW, oral tradition, that goes back before Paul. There's actually a lot of these. We have some of them not just from Paul either. So through textual criticism, we can not me, but historians can identify that there are things that clearly weren't written by Paul that he's just quoting word for word, little rhyming creeds, little things that they would have repeated in the church over and over again to help everybody memorize, given that most people back then didn't know how to read. They had little rhyming things. Just like in math class, my math teacher taught me the quadratic formula is square the front, square the back. No. Let's see, how it go? Quadratic formula. Minus b, plus or minus square root, b squared minus 4ac, b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a. And I'll be honest with you, when I first was about to say that to you just now, I couldn't remember it. And all I remembered was minus b. I didn't remember the quadratic formula, and then I just started singing it, and I remembered it all. Because a little song, helps you memorize things. So, they can notice those properties in 2 Corinthians 15 where Paul lists out all these, witnesses to the resurrection. The people that, actually, he says he appeared to so-and-so, and he appeared to so-and-so, and he appeared to so-and-so. This is one of those little creeds, those little rhyming things, little song things. And he says to the Corinthians that he received it and he passed it on to them. So, we know it goes back to before he first visited them. So 1 Corinthians is dated to 55 AD. Then this is something that goes back to when Paul visited them before 55 AD. So, when was Jesus crucified? We're not real sure. 35, 37, somewhere in there. The traditional date's 33. We're pretty sure we got to bump it back a few years. Okay, so when did Paul visit them again? Historians work real hard on a timeline for Paul. They've got a pretty good idea, but then it's like, well, when could he have received this? And there's only certain times when he really, what's considered most likely is that probably he received this 2 to 3 years. Even the skeptical atheist historian, or really agnostic historian, Bart Ehrman says it was probably 2 to 3 years after the crucifixion. He received this from these people. So like this little creed is not Paul. This is something that we can tell through historical techniques that it's not coming from Paul. It's coming from these original witnesses, and it goes back earlier than Paul, and it's preserved in writing for us, but it's actually an oral tradition, and it's older than Paul. So this is a little list of witnesses. Now, this list doesn't tell us that whether these were multimodal or unimodal in nature, but it does tell us that there were group appearances. So like we get an idea of like and the one that comes to us the most from the historical documents is this just like appearance to the apostles in general, as 1 Corinthians 15 says, to the 12. Okay, that seems the one that comes up the most. It keeps coming up. It comes up in the Gospels, and it comes up in our other sources too, because it makes sense. Like we've got other sources that are just going to say Jesus appeared to the apostles, and it's like, okay, that's probably this 1 to the 12. That's what's most likely. So again, that number 12, or let's just say Thomas wasn't there, and Judas, we'll just say 10. At the very least, it's Peter and 2 other people, as we're going to see. Our later Christian sources, tell us that Peter and those with him, but it's more likely, what's most probable is this 1 to the 12 that Paul talks about, that goes back to this oral tradition. So there's 2 witnesses to like what they believed, and but let's get on to these later witnesses. So we've got this early Christian father of the church, what's called apostolic church father, which means the era that came right after the apostles that would have known the apostles. So this guy's named Polycarp. Okay, it's considered, I don't think it's really contested. When I read, I hadn't seen it contested anywhere. Polycarp knew John. He knew John the Apostle. Okay, one of the reasons we can say this is we have a later Christian named Irenaeus, who writes to his friend Florinius. And so Irenaeus and Florinius apparently were both students of Polycarp. And Florinius has fallen away from Christianity and gotten into the Valentinian. It's Gnosticism, and we don't need to go into that right now, what that was. But it was this like other group that seemed similar to Christianity, but was also radically different. But anyway, the thing about that is when Irenaeus writes to Florinius that they were both students of Polycarp, he's not going to lie to Florinius about that. Because it's just like you don't write to somebody something where they know the truth and lie to them about something like that. You just don't do that. Like that would, unless you have serious mental problems, that would show up in what you write. Like Irenaeus is, it's book 1, book 2, and book 3 of Against Heresies. Like it's long. Okay, he talks to them about, he writes to Florinius about how Polycarp taught them about his own conversion to Christianity. So this is, we know that this is Polycarp's recounting of the story to them. This is historical, okay? All right, and he talks about how John was the one that converted to Christianity and how he learned from John. Okay, so in Polycarp's case, this is important. His commitment to Christ is known. He's a willing martyr who was martyred in Rome. And so again, just like with Peter and Paul, if he was martyred in Rome, there would have been public records of this. the story that we have of the martyrdom of Polycarp, I think it is a little bit doubted, or people think it might have been fluffed up. But it appears that it happened in a huge arena with a big crowd. So, and he was burned alive for his faith in Christ. And Polycarp, we have one of his surviving letters where he writes to the church in Philippi, and he attests to the apostles' willingness to die and how the church in Philippi saw it in Peter and Paul and the other apostles. They were willing to put their lives on the line for Christianity, okay? And he's very clear, Polycarp goes into detail about this, that they're imitating Christ's endurance. How Christ himself died, then appeared to them alive, and that's why they are unafraid to die. And why they do what they do. Okay, so, again, that's just part of our evidence that the apostles were willing to die. Okay, and in some of the cases they did die. Alright, so we know that this later guy named Ignatius knew Polycarp. Okay? Probably didn't know John because Polycarp lived to be we think probably 86. Okay, so Polycarp was old. But Ignatius and Polycarp knew each other because we have correspondence between them in their letters. Okay, so we have letters back and forth. Ignatius appears to, he writes a letter to the Smyrnians, which, by the way, the church in Smyrna was actually Polycarp's church. Okay, he writes to them, and he's addressing this heresy that arose about whether or not Jesus' resurrection was physical or purely non-physical, spiritual, And so the issue is, this seems to be a thing that arises. Luke seems to be addressing this. He seems to be emphasizing the physicality. Jesus ate the fish, and he's like, reach out and give me a hug. He prays over. He's walking and talking with Luke puts all that stuff in there. He seems to be addressing this controversy that comes up in Christianity. It's the docetic controversy. Docetism is the idea that Jesus was never physical. He just was God taking on the illusion of appearing to be a physical man, but was never physical. So, this doesn't seem to appear as a controversy within Christianity until you get to the later books of the New Testament. Like Luke would have been written a little later, whereas the books of Paul would have been written earlier. Or 1 John was written later, and 1 John straight up says in 1 John chapter 4 that anyone that admits that Christ has come in the flesh, he says people that won't admit that are antichrist, So this docetic controversy, there are different groups that would have believed it, but it appears to have been a later controversy in Christianity as Christianity spread to these Greek-speaking places, and that makes perfectly plausible sense because how do I put it? Plato was this Greek philosopher, and Platonism and the whole school of Plato in Athens was very influential. One of the prevailing dominant views, not the only one, but Plato would always use the example of a chair, and he would say you can tell that it's an imperfect chair. And how could you tell that it's an imperfect chair unless the perfect chair exists in your mind? So the world that exists in your mind is the perfect, the world of forms. Another way to think of it is you can never physically draw a perfect circle, but you can represent one mathematically in your mind, in the world of the mental. So Plato believed that the world of forms actually existed, and that's where you want to go. That's where the ideal exists. Everything in the physical is somehow flawed and not ideal. So everything that exists in the physical world was created as an imitation of the ideal, in accordance with the ideals, but none of it is, in fact, ideal. He made arguments for God's existence based on this that later Christians used, for supreme God's existence. Because he would say, since we all have souls, there must be a most perfect soul, a soul with no flaws. There you have the most perfect soul is God. But that's how, Plato's philosophical argument, I mean, I'm probably butchering it, because it's not important for this video, but you can see how, if this is such a big deal in the Greek-speaking world, that, like, since the New Testament is written in Greek, and you've got Luke, written later, that they think John probably 90 to 100 AD is the last part of the New Testament written. But you've got like 1 John, it's later. You can see why this controversy existed. Well, Ignatius, remember our Ignatius, he seems to be dealing with it. And just to point this out, there were controversies right from the early church. We go back to the letters of Paul. It's pretty clear that like there was this controversy over whether or not Gentiles had to follow Jewish law. But then it seems like there was later this controversy coming from the Gentiles about whether or not Jesus was raised bodily. Okay, so the Ignatius is the guy who knew Polycarp. Polycarp's the guy who knew John. Okay, Ignatius, in his letter to the Smyrnians in the 3rd chapter in the 1st and 2nd verse, he may be quoting Luke. Regardless, he's a source in this case. Ignatius was in a position to know Polycarp. Polycarp was in a position to know John. Okay? And Polycarp was willing to die for his faith. And Ignatius was too. That doesn't mean that everything they said was true, but it means that they really believed the stuff they said about the appearances of Christ. Because that's, according to them, that's why they were willing to die. Ignatius went on this like martyr walk visited every church on his way to Rome, and then he writes a letter to them, and he writes a letter to the church in Rome saying, now y'all don't try to prevent them from killing me. I'm going to be martyred. Don't y'all, I'm not going to try to get out of this, and all this. So like and he says he's imitating what he saw in the apostles. Like they both do. Him and Polycarp both do. That's why they're so inspired by this. And the apostles apparently were inspired by Jesus. Okay, so he writes to the Smyrnians this, and he makes a point that the appearance to the apostles was visual, and it was auditory, and it was tactile. Okay? So, like, he adds more than what Luke says. But, like, since he clearly believed in this, and he was in a position to know what he was talking about, then this becomes a source for us on that we have multimodal hallucinations. Okay.